The ruins of Sector 7 stretched out under the gray sky like the bones of a dead city. Commander Luke Harrison moved through the broken streets with his squad, their boots crunching on debris and shattered stone. The conquest had ended 3 days ago. Now there was only silence and the work of securing what remained. Luke was not like most commanders. He noticed things others did not. The way dust settled differently near certain buildings. The faint warmth still rising from collapsed walls. And now, a sound so small that most soldiers would have missed it entirely. A whimper. Something between a cry and a chirp. Luke stopped walking and raised his hand. His squad halted behind him. Private Danny Foster, the youngest soldier in the unit, looked confused. Sergeant Marcus Webb kept his eyes forward, always watchful. The others said nothing. They had learned to trust Luke's instincts. The sound came again. It was coming from beneath a pile of rubble near what had once been a marketplace. Luke moved toward it carefully, stepping over broken metal and shattered glass. His squad followed without question. He started moving rocks away with his hands. The others joined in. After several minutes, they uncovered a small crevice where the building had partially collapsed. Inside, huddled in the darkness, was a creature Luke had never seen before. It was no bigger than a cat, with scales that shimmered like dark blue metal in the fading light. It had 4 legs, a long curved tail, and wings folded tightly against its small body. Its eyes were large and bright gold, filled with fear and pain. There was blood on its left wing, and one of its back legs hung at an odd angle. A baby dragon. An actual living dragon. For a moment, nobody moved. The squad stared at the creature. Luke knew what the protocol was. Any alien life form discovered in conquered territory had to be reported to High Command immediately. There would be questions, interviews, and almost certainly orders to destroy it. Dragons had been classified as threats by the War Council. The species had resisted human expansion into their territories with fierce aggression. That was why the army had come. But Luke was looking at a baby. A creature that could barely move. A creature that was looking at him with something that resembled hope. "Contact High Command," he heard himself say. "Sir?" Marcus asked. "No," Luke said quietly. "No, I mean, everyone back away. This is a contamination zone. We need to set up a perimeter." He did not look at his squad. He knew what he was doing was wrong according to every rule and regulation. But something inside him would not accept leaving this creature to die alone in the dark. The squad exchanged glances. Danny Foster looked like he wanted to say something. But Marcus Webb simply nodded and began ordering the others back. In the military, soldiers learned when to question orders and when to trust their commander. Luke had earned that trust over 5 years of service. Luke reached into the crevice slowly, speaking in soft tones. "It is okay, little one. I am not going to hurt you." The dragon hissed, a sound like steam escaping from a pipe. But it did not attack. It was too weak, too hurt. Luke wrapped the creature carefully in his jacket and lifted it gently. The dragon weighed almost nothing. He walked back to the base camp alone, keeping the jacket close to his chest. The evening was turning cold, and he could feel the creature trembling. It made small sounds, soft chirps and whimpers, but it did not struggle. It was as if the dragon understood that Luke meant it no harm. Back at the base, Luke moved quickly to his quarters. He locked the door and carefully unwrapped his jacket. The dragon lay on his bunk, breathing heavily. Up close, it was even more beautiful. The scales had patterns in them, lighter blue running through the darker shade like water through stone. Luke found medical supplies in his footlocker. He cleaned the blood from the dragon's wing as gently as he could. The creature flinched but made no aggressive sound. The wing had a deep gash, but Luke did not think it was broken. The back leg was more concerning. He wrapped it as best he could with bandages meant for human soldiers. He found water in a sealed container and poured some into his helmet. The dragon drank it eagerly, its small tongue flicking out. Then it looked at Luke, and something shifted in those gold eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or trust. Luke sat on his bunk beside the creature. He did not know what he was going to do. This was going to be discovered. There was no way he could hide a living dragon in his quarters for very long. But for now, in this moment, there was only the soft sound of the creature's breathing and the faint warmth of its small body beside him. The dragon made a low chirping sound. It was not fear. It was not aggression. It was something that sounded almost like contentment. And then, slowly, it moved closer to Luke. Its small head pressed against his arm, and it closed its eyes. Luke found himself smiling. He reached out and gently ran his fingers along the creature's back. The scales were warm and smooth. Whatever trouble this was going to bring, whatever military court-martials might be in his future, in this moment it did not matter. He had found this creature abandoned and hurt. And somehow, impossibly, it seemed to understand that this human, this soldier, this man, was someone who could be trusted. Luke closed his eyes and felt the small dragon shift in its sleep, nestling closer against him. He had no plan. He had no way forward. He only knew that he could not let this creature die. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Tomorrow might bring the end of his career. But tonight, in the darkness of his quarters, a small dragon called Luke Dad without words, simply through the act of trust. And Luke Harrison, the soldier who followed orders and did his duty, made a choice that would change everything. 3 weeks had passed since Luke found the dragon in the ruins of Sector 7. 3 weeks of careful hiding, of whispered conversations, and of watching a small creature grow stronger with each passing day. Luke had named the dragon Kale, a simple name that seemed to fit the curious and intelligent being that was becoming less of a mystery and more of a companion. The dragon's injured wing had healed remarkably fast. Luke changed the bandages every morning and evening, watching as the gash slowly sealed itself. The back leg that had hung at an odd angle was now strong enough to support Kale's weight. The creature moved around Luke's quarters with increasing confidence, exploring every corner with careful steps and curious tilts of its head. Luke had learned that Kale was far more intelligent than any animal he had ever encountered. The dragon learned commands quickly. When Luke pointed to the water bowl, Kale would drink. When Luke raised his hand, the dragon would come immediately. When Luke made a low sound, Kale would settle down and rest. It was as if the creature understood not just the commands, but the intentions behind them. But growth brought problems. Kale was getting bigger. What had started as a creature the size of a cat was now nearly the size of a large dog. The dragon's scales were deepening in color, becoming a richer, darker blue. Its wings, once small and fragile, were expanding into something that would eventually allow flight. Luke knew the creature would not stay small and hidden forever. On the evening of the 21st day, Luke received a message that turned his stomach cold. High Command was issuing a new directive. All personnel on base were required to listen to a military broadcast at the evening meal assembly. It was mandatory attendance. Luke sat in the mess hall with his squad around him. Hundreds of soldiers filled the space, talking quietly and eating their rations. When the commanding general stepped up to the podium, conversations died away. As you know, the general began, we have expanded our territorial control across this sector. However, intelligence reports suggest that the dragon species is far more organized and dangerous than originally believed. They have coordinated attacks in 3 separate regions. They are a threat to human expansion and to our soldiers' safety. Luke felt his hands clench beneath the table. Effective immediately, the general continued, any dragon life form encountered on Imperial territory is to be terminated immediately. This is not a request. This is not optional. Any soldier who discovers a dragon and fails to report it or fails to take action will face court-martial and imprisonment. These creatures are a strategic threat. They cannot be reasoned with. They cannot be negotiated with. They must be eliminated. The general stepped back from the podium. The broadcast ended. Soldiers resumed their conversations, but the energy in the room had changed. Luke noticed Marcus Webb watching him carefully from across the table. The sergeant had suspicions. Luke could see it in the way Marcus looked at him, then quickly looked away. That night, Luke returned to his quarters. Kale was waiting by the door, making soft chirping sounds. The dragon had learned to listen for Luke's footsteps and would greet him each time he returned. But tonight, Luke felt the weight of what he was doing settle heavily on his shoulders. He sat on his bunk, and Kale climbed up beside him, pressing its small head against Luke's chest. The dragon made a contented sound, but Luke could barely feel it. His mind was racing. The order was clear. Absolute. If anyone discovered Kale, Luke would not only lose the dragon but would face imprisonment. His career, his life, everything he had built would be destroyed. But the thought of turning Kale over to be killed was unbearable. Luke had seen the dragon grow. He had watched Kale learn and adapt. He had felt the creature's trust and affection. This was not some mindless beast. This was a living, thinking, feeling being that had chosen to trust him. Over the next few days, Luke noticed more soldiers watching him. Private Foster asked to speak with him privately and mentioned that Luke seemed different lately. Sergeant Webb made comments about Luke spending a lot of time in his quarters. Lance Corporal Steve Allen asked if Luke was feeling sick. None of them were pressing the issue, but they were noticing. They were asking questions without asking them directly. Luke understood what was happening. His squad was giving him a chance to explain, to confide in them if he wanted to. But he could not risk it. The more people who knew about Kale, the more danger the dragon was in. On the evening of day 28, Luke was in the training facility using a combat dummy to work through some frustration. Kale had followed him there, staying hidden in the shadows of the facility. No one was around. Luke was alone, and he needed to work through the panic and helplessness that had been building inside him. He struck the dummy with force. Once. Twice. Again and again. His fists landed hard, and he barely felt the impact. How was he supposed to choose between the dragon he had come to love and the life he had built? How was he supposed to live with either choice? Suddenly, Kale emerged from the shadows. The dragon's small form moved with purpose. It saw the dummy Luke was striking, and something shifted in its expression. The creature made a sound Luke had never heard before, a low growl that seemed to come from deep within its body. Then Kale charged. The dragon struck the dummy with its claws and teeth. Its movements were not wild or panicked. They were controlled, powerful, and incredibly fast. Kale's wings flared open, and the creature slashed at the dummy with the precision of a trained fighter. The fabric tore. Stuffing flew through the air. Then, just as quickly as it had started, Kale stopped. The dragon turned away from the destroyed dummy and walked back to Luke. The creature pressed its head against Luke's leg, making soft sounds again. But those sounds were different now. They seemed to say something. They seemed to say that Kale would protect Luke. That the dragon would fight for him. That no matter what happened, they would face it together. Luke knelt down and wrapped his arms around the dragon. He felt the rapid beating of Kale's heart, fast and strong. The creature leaned into him, and Luke closed his eyes. He had a choice to make. He could continue to hide and hope he was never discovered. Or he could do something that would change everything. Luke did not know which path was right. But he knew that the little dragon that called him Dad would follow him down either road. And that knowledge terrified and comforted him in equal measure. The morning sun cast long shadows across the base as Luke received the order he had been dreading. Mandatory base inspection. All personnel and all quarters would be checked. The inspection was scheduled for 1400 hours. That gave Luke less than 6 hours to figure out what to do. He sat on his bunk with Kale pressed against his side. The dragon had grown to the size of a medium dog now, and its scales had developed a sheen that seemed to glow in the light. The creature looked up at Luke with those gold eyes, sensing his distress. Kale made a soft chirping sound, as if trying to comfort him. Luke could not run. There was nowhere to go. The base was surrounded by desert and hostile territory. He could not hide Kale better than he already had. The quarters would be thoroughly searched. His choices were simple and terrible. He could attempt to smuggle Kale away and likely die in the attempt. He could turn the dragon over to be killed. Or he could reveal Kale to the entire army and face whatever came next. By 1000 hours, Luke had made his decision. It was not a plan born of wisdom or strategy. It was born of desperation and something deeper. It was born of a love for this creature that had grown in his heart over the past month. He walked to the central assembly grounds where soldiers were already gathering for the inspection. Kale followed behind him, the dragon moving with the grace of something far older and wiser than its small body suggested. Luke did not hide the creature. He walked openly, letting every soldier see him. The reaction was immediate. Conversations stopped. Soldiers pointed and stared. Someone shouted an alarm. But Luke kept walking forward, and Kale stayed at his side, calm and controlled. By the time Luke reached the center of the assembly grounds, hundreds of soldiers had turned to look at him. Officers began moving through the crowd, reaching for weapons. Military police started running toward Luke's position. The entire base was erupting into chaos. Luke stopped and stood still. He placed one hand on Kale's head, a gesture of protection. The dragon did not move. The creature simply stood beside Luke, completely still, completely calm. An officer drew his gun and shouted for Luke to step away from the creature. But Luke did not move. Instead, he raised his other hand in a peaceful gesture. "This dragon is not a weapon," Luke called out, his voice carrying across the assembly grounds. "This is a living being. A thinking being. A being that deserves the chance to live." The military police moved closer. The officer with the gun was advancing. Luke felt his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the moment when everything would end. But then something incredible happened. Kale released a cry that echoed across the entire base. It was not a roar of aggression or a scream of pain. It was a call, something ancient and powerful that seemed to come from deep within the dragon's soul. And then the small creature moved. But Kale did not attack. The dragon pushed through the crowd of soldiers, not fighting them, not harming them, simply moving with purpose and determination. Soldiers jumped back, some falling to the ground. But Kale did not attack anyone. The dragon simply moved forward, cutting a path through the chaos. The crowd parted. Soldiers stepped back, creating a corridor through the hundreds of people gathered on the grounds. Kale walked straight through that corridor, and at the end of it stood Luke. The dragon stopped at Luke and pressed its small head against the commander's chest, exactly as it had in Luke's quarters 1,000 times before. Luke wrapped his arms around the dragon. For a moment, the entire assembly grounds went silent. Every soldier on the base was staring at the same scene. A human and a dragon, bonded in a way that transcended war and orders and protocol. Kale's eyes were closed. The creature was making soft chirping sounds, gentle and peaceful. Luke could feel the rapid beating of the dragon's heart, but it was not the heartbeat of something afraid. It was the heartbeat of something that had found what it was looking for. It was the heartbeat of something that had finally found home. The officer with the gun had stopped advancing. His weapon hung at his side, forgotten. Sergeant Marcus Webb was standing nearby, his face unreadable, but his eyes were wet. Private Danny Foster had his hand over his mouth. Lance Corporal Steve Allen and the others of Luke's squad were not moving, not speaking, simply watching. All around the assembly grounds, soldiers were standing in complete silence. Luke could see it in their expressions. They had been told that dragons were weapons, threats, things to be destroyed. But what they were seeing was something different. They were seeing trust. They were seeing love. They were seeing something that transcended the simple categories of soldier and enemy. An older officer, Colonel Sarah Bradford, stepped forward slowly. Her weapon was holstered. Her hands were visible and empty. She moved until she was standing near Luke and Kale. "Step back, soldier," someone shouted. "The creature is dangerous." Colonel Bradford did not listen. She approached Luke carefully, making no sudden movements. She reached out her hand toward Kale, but she was not threatening. She was simply reaching out. The dragon lifted its head and looked at the colonel. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Kale made a soft chirping sound and allowed Colonel Bradford to place her hand on the creature's neck. The colonel stood there for several seconds, her hand touching the dragon's scales. When she stepped back, her eyes were also wet. She turned to face the assembled army. "Stand down," she commanded. "All personnel stand down. This is not a threat. This is something we need to understand." For the first time since Luke had brought Kale into the assembly grounds, he felt the tension in his chest ease. The dragon made a content sound and leaned against him again, pressing its small head against Luke's heart. The silence that fell over the assembly grounds that day was not a silence of fear or confusion. It was a silence of understanding. It was a silence that said something fundamental had changed. A silence that said the world would never be quite the same again. Luke closed his eyes and felt Kale's warm body against his own. The dragon that called him Dad had just changed the course of an entire war with nothing but trust and love. And standing there in the center of the base, surrounded by hundreds of soldiers, Luke Harrison understood that whatever came next, they would face it together. The interrogation room was cold and sterile. Luke sat across from Colonel Sarah Bradford and two other officers he did not recognize. One of them held a tablet displaying the video footage from the assembly grounds. The other had a recording device running, capturing everything Luke said. Kale was not in the room. They had taken the dragon away for examination, though Colonel Bradford had promised the creature would not be harmed. Luke had been here for 3 hours. "Walk us through it again, Commander," one of the unfamiliar officers said. His name was Major Henry Cross, and he had been asking the same questions repeatedly, as if Luke might change his story if asked enough times. Luke took a breath. He had already explained everything multiple times. How he found Kale in the ruins. How he hid the dragon. How he knew about the order to kill all dragons on sight. How he had chosen to reveal Kale rather than see the creature executed. "I found an injured creature," Luke said for the 4th time. "I helped it. The creature bonded with me. I could not let it be killed." "You violated direct military orders," Major Cross said. "You failed to report a discovered alien life form. You attempted to conceal evidence from high command. These are serious crimes, Commander Harrison." "I understand," Luke replied. "Do you?" another officer asked. Her name was Captain Linda Torres, and she seemed less hostile than Major Cross. "Do you understand that what you did could have started an interspecies incident? If that creature had attacked soldiers, we could be in full-scale war right now." "Kale would not have attacked," Luke said firmly. "You cannot know that," Major Cross snapped. "You are emotionally compromised. You have bonded with this creature in a way that clouds your judgment." Before Luke could respond, the door to the interrogation room opened. A tall man in civilian clothes entered. He had gray hair and sharp eyes. Colonel Bradford stood immediately, showing respect. The officers across from Luke also stood. "Dr. Nathan Gray, the director of the Scientific Research Division," Colonel Bradford said. "He has just completed the initial examination of the dragon." Dr. Gray took a seat at the table. He opened a folder and spread several papers across the surface. Luke could see photographs and notes, though he could not read them from where he sat. "Fascinating," Dr. Gray said, looking at Luke. "Absolutely fascinating. Commander, this creature you have been caring for is not what we thought dragons were at all." "What do you mean?" Major Cross asked. "We have been operating under the assumption that dragons are aggressive animals, similar to large predators," Dr. Gray said. "But this specimen shows signs of remarkable cognitive development. The neural pathways in the creature's brain are complex. The creature shows signs of emotional intelligence and attachment behavior. It is not a mindless beast. It is an intelligent being, possibly comparable to human intelligence in some respects." Luke felt a surge of vindication. He had known this about Kale. He had seen it every day. "Furthermore," Dr. Gray continued, "I have reviewed the military records of dragon encounters. Most of the aggressive behavior we attributed to dragons occurred after humans attacked them first. When we look at the data without bias, we see a pattern of defensive behavior, not aggressive hunting." "Are you suggesting the dragons are not a threat?" Captain Torres asked. "I am suggesting we may have made a terrible mistake," Dr. Gray said. "This creature bonded with Commander Harrison despite being a different species. It showed no aggression. It demonstrated trust. It allowed other soldiers to touch it. These are not the behaviors of a threat. These are the behaviors of an intelligent species capable of coexistence with humans." Major Cross looked uncomfortable. "This changes nothing about Commander Harrison's crimes. He violated direct orders." "Actually," Colonel Bradford said, speaking for the first time since Dr. Gray had entered, "it changes everything. The orders were based on false information. We were told to execute creatures we believed to be threats. We now have evidence that those creatures are not threats at all. We need more research," Dr. Gray added. We need to understand dragon society, their language, their culture. And the only way we can do that is through continued observation and peaceful contact. The door opened again. This time, a general entered. General Frederick Wilson, commander of the entire base. Everyone stood except Luke, who remained in his chair, unsure of the protocol. General Wilson sat down slowly. He looked at the video on Major Cross's tablet, then at the photographs Dr. Gray had laid out. Then he looked directly at Luke. "You knew this creature would be killed if you reported it," the general said. "Yes, sir," Luke replied. "You chose to hide it, despite the risk to yourself." "Yes, sir." "You then revealed it to the entire army, knowing it could have resulted in your death or the creature's death." "Yes, sir." Because hiding was not a solution. Kale deserved to be seen. Kale deserved the chance to show who it really is. General Wilson leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured and thoughtful. "In my 30 years of military service, I have given many orders. Some of them were right. Some of them were wrong. The order to exterminate dragons was wrong. I gave that order based on incomplete information and fear." The general paused. "Commander Harrison, you showed more wisdom today than I have shown in 3 decades. You saw a living being and chose compassion. You took an enormous personal risk because you believed in something greater than protocol. What does this mean for the commander?" Captain Torres asked. "It means," General Wilson said, "that Commander Harrison will not be court-martialed. In fact, I am recommending him for commendation. His actions today have prevented what could have been a catastrophic mistake." Major Cross looked like he wanted to argue, but he said nothing. "We are going to establish a new division," General Wilson continued. "A diplomatic and research initiative focused on understanding dragon society and establishing peaceful relations. Dr. Gray will head the scientific division. Colonel Bradford will head the diplomatic division. And Commander Harrison, I am asking if you would be willing to serve as the liaison between the military and the dragons. Your bond with this creature, Kale, makes you uniquely qualified for this role." Luke felt something break open in his chest. Relief. Joy. Gratitude. But mostly, he felt hope. "I would be honored, sir," Luke said. "Good," General Wilson replied. He stood up. "I want to see this creature. I want to understand what it is that made Commander Harrison willing to risk everything." They walked together through the corridors of the base. When they reached the observation area where Kale was being kept, the dragon immediately began making soft chirping sounds. The creature recognized Luke's footsteps, Luke's presence. The glass of the observation window separated them, but Kale approached it, pressing against the surface. Luke did the same, placing his hand against the glass. The dragon's eye was directly across from his. General Wilson stood silently, watching the connection between human and dragon. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and filled with wonder. "I see it," he said simply. "I see why you did what you did. That is not an animal. That is family." Luke nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. The little dragon that called him Dad had not only changed Luke's life. The creature had changed the trajectory of an entire military and the future of an entire species. 6 months had passed since the day Kale stood in the assembly grounds and pressed its head against Luke's chest. 6 months since the entire army went silent and the world changed forever. The sanctuary had been built on the eastern side of the base, a vast structure of open spaces and natural terrain designed to give dragons room to grow and live. It was called the Dragon Heritage Center, a facility dedicated to research, education, and peaceful coexistence between humans and dragons. Luke walked through the grounds in the early morning light, watching as Kale soared overhead on wings that had fully developed. The dragon was much larger now. What had started as a creature the size of a cat had grown into something magnificent. Kale's wingspan stretched nearly 15 feet, and the creature's body was long and powerful. But the most remarkable thing about Kale had not changed. The dragon still came to Luke. The dragon still made those soft chirping sounds when it saw him. The dragon still trusted Luke completely. "Beautiful, is not it?" a voice said behind Luke. Luke turned to see Sergeant Marcus Webb approaching. The sergeant had become one of the most dedicated members of the Dragon Sanctuary team. Marcus spent hours every day studying dragon behavior, learning their patterns, trying to understand their language. Kale grows stronger every day, Marcus said. Look at those wings. That dragon will be able to fly across continents before long. I know, Luke replied, watching as Kale performed a graceful turn in the sky. But Kale will always come back here. Will always come back to me. Marcus nodded. He had seen the bond between Luke and Kale firsthand. It was something that went beyond the typical relationship between handler and animal. It was something deeper. Something that had fundamentally changed how the military understood other species. Over the past 6 months, the sanctuary had grown. 3 more dragons had been discovered and brought to the facility. Each one had been injured or abandoned, just like Kale. Each one had bonded with human handlers who showed them kindness and patience. And each one had proven that dragons were not the mindless threats the military had originally believed them to be. Dr. Nathan Gray's research had uncovered remarkable things about dragon physiology and behavior. Dragons had complex social structures. They had hierarchies and family units. They communicated through sounds and body language. They were capable of problem solving and abstract thinking. They experienced emotions. They could feel joy and sorrow and fear and love. The military had issued new guidelines. No dragon would be harmed without absolute proof of aggression. Any dragon encountered would be treated as a potential intelligent being requiring careful observation and peaceful contact. The change in policy had rippled across the entire military structure. More importantly, the change had rippled across the entire human perspective on the conquest of this world. General Frederick Wilson had made a historic announcement 3 months ago. The military would no longer pursue expansion into dragon territories. Instead, a diplomatic corps would be established to negotiate with dragon populations. The goal was no longer conquest but coexistence. Luke walked to a stone bench overlooking the sanctuary and sat down. Kale immediately descended from the sky, circling once before landing gracefully beside him. The dragon was so large now that its head reached well above Luke's shoulders, but the creature moved with the same gentleness it had shown when it was small. Luke ran his hand along Kale's neck, feeling the warm scales beneath his palm. The dragon made a soft sound and closed its eyes, enjoying the contact. This simple gesture, this touch, had sparked a transformation that was still unfolding. Private Danny Foster approached, carrying a tablet. The young soldier had become one of the sanctuary's most promising researchers. He had spent countless hours observing dragon behavior and had begun to identify patterns in their communication. "Commander," Danny said excitedly, "we think we have identified the first word in dragon language. Kale makes this specific sound when it sees you. We believe it is a name. Kale is calling you something specific. Calling you something that means more than just your human name." Luke looked at the tablet, seeing the sound wave Danny had recorded. It was a low, gentle rumble with a high chirp at the end. Simple but distinctive. "What do you think it means?" Luke asked. "Based on the context and the way Kale makes the sound," Danny said carefully, "we believe it translates to something like family or protector or father. The dragons appear to use the same sound for concepts we would express with different words." Luke felt his throat tighten with emotion. All this time, he had believed that Kale called him Dad through affection and behavior. But to know that the dragon had an actual word, an actual sound that expressed that bond, that meant something deeper than he had even imagined. Kale made that exact sound, as if responding to Danny's explanation. The dragon turned to look at Luke, and those gold eyes seemed to hold infinite depth and understanding. Over the coming weeks, more soldiers volunteered to work at the sanctuary. What had started as a secret hidden in Luke's quarters had become a movement. Soldiers who had been trained to destroy now learned to protect. Soldiers who had been taught that all dragons were threats now learned to see intelligence and feeling in those creatures. Colonel Sarah Bradford oversaw the training of the new diplomatic corps. She had told Luke that she would never forget the moment she placed her hand on Kale's neck in the assembly grounds. That moment had shown her that everything she had believed about this war was wrong. The dragons were not enemies. They were a people. They deserved respect and recognition. The turning point had come on a clear evening, 3 weeks after the sanctuary was established. Kale had flown beyond the sanctuary boundaries, and Luke had worried the dragon might not return. But as darkness fell, Kale appeared on the horizon, and following the dragon were 5 other dragons. 5 wild dragons, drawn by Kale's call. Kale had gone out into the world and brought others to the sanctuary. The dragons had chosen to trust humans because one dragon had chosen to trust one human. Now, as Luke sat with Kale on the stone bench watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, he thought about the path that had led to this moment. A single act of compassion. A commander who refused to let an injured creature die. A dragon that learned to trust. And somehow, impossibly, that simple beginning had transformed an entire military and rewritten the future of an entire world. Kale pressed its massive head against Luke's shoulder, making that low rumbling sound that meant family. Around the sanctuary, other dragons rested on the ground or flew through the evening air. Humans and dragons shared the space together, learning from each other, building something new. The silence that had fallen over the assembly ground 6 months ago had been the silence of understanding. It had been the moment when humans realized that intelligence and feeling could exist in forms they had never expected. It had been the moment when compassion proved stronger than orders, and love proved stronger than fear. Luke Harrison had not set out to change the world. He had only wanted to save one small creature. But sometimes, history turns on the smallest gestures. Sometimes, the future is written not in grand strategies or military maneuvers, but in the simple act of one being choosing to protect another. As night fell over the sanctuary, Luke sat beneath the stars with Kale, and the dragon that called him Dad made that gentle sound over and over again. A sound that meant family. A sound that meant hope. A sound that meant the world would never be quite the same again.